One of the questions I get asked really regularly is, tell me about watercolour paper. What one should I use? Why are there different surfaces? Which is the best for what? What sort of weight should I be looking for on my watercolour paper? Hello, my name is Liz Chadderton. I'm a watercolour artist based in Berkshire. Every week I share a tip, trick or technique that I wish I'd known about ages ago. And this week I want to share with you the 3 different surfaces that we use for watercolour paper: hot press, cold press and rough, so that you can know which is most suited to what sort of work, what the strengths and weaknesses, advantages, disadvantages are of each. It'll really help you choose, and getting the right paper really elevates your watercolour to the next level. So I've just been sent these 3 pads of watercolour paper from Meeden. Thank you very much for that. I thought it would be the perfect opportunity for us to look at them together and work out what to look for. But I guess the first question is, why is watercolour paper so important? And that's simple, because it actually becomes part of your painting. On a canvas, if you're painting with acrylics or oils, the canvas surface is usually totally covered. And yes, of course, it's important, the quality of that, but not in the same way, because for watercolour, our paper becomes part of our painting. Our paper is the white of paint in our palette. We don't have a white paint, so leaving some of that paper to show through is not only normal, it's good, it's expected. That sparkle of the white paper brings our lovely paintings to life. So having a decent paper is crucial. And in fact, I'd go as far as to say, spend your money on the paper and you can paint a really good painting with fairly poor quality paints on good paper, but you can have the most brilliant paints in the world, and if you're working on poor paper, you will just not get the same results. So if you're struggling and following tutorials and your painting never seems to quite look like the tutors, it could be down to the paper you're using. I would say get a decent quality paper even when you're beginning, even when you're practicing, even when you're doing exercises, and it will reward you. The first thing to consider is, what is it made out of? So this one, 100% cotton, and most papers are either cotton or made out of wood. And there's quite a lot of snobbery about that. Some people swear blind you should only ever use cotton papers. I don't subscribe to that. I have used shockingly bad quality cotton papers, and I have used very good quality wood papers. You just need to understand what you're using. So the reason people like cotton papers is that cotton is a long fibre, and therefore it gives, on the whole, a stronger paper, which allows you to layer upon layer of your colours before they dull. It allows you to lift your colours without damaging the paper. Cotton tends to absorb more water, that gives you a longer painting time. That is if it's a good quality paper. But as I say, you can get very poor quality cotton papers, whereas equally a wood paper, as long as it is acid free, so the wood has natural acids in it, they take that out, so it's acid free. It means it won't go a funny colour with time, it won't become brittle and dusty, it should last for 100 years, then wood paper might be the way to go. Wood paper tends to be a little cheaper than cotton paper, but you need to find a paper that suits you and your price range. The other things now, there are different fibres. You can get bamboo papers, you can get sugarcane papers, and you can get papers that are a mix. So it might be 30% cotton, 70% wood, or some cotton, some bamboo. And the reason people are moving away from cotton, or not moving away, but just mindful of cotton, is that it's such a water intensive crop. And given that we are in a thirsty world, some people choose to avoid cotton for environmental reasons. So we want to know that it is acid free. Not all papers are, and if it's acid free or archival, it won't go like a newspaper does when you leave it in the sunshine and go all yellow and sort of crispy. The thing you want to know about is the weight. So this is grams per square metre. That's the metric way of doing it. And that's literally, if I had a square metre of this paper, it would weigh 300 grams. Just to be awkward, that is the equivalent of 140 pounds, which is the imperial way of doing it. And 140 pounds relates to 500 sheets of imperial size watercolour paper, which is 30 by 22 inches. So if I had 500 sheets of that size, it would weigh 140 pounds. I hope you agree that maybe that's easier to remember. And when are you ever going to have 500 sheets? Anyway, that's just what it means. The bigger the number, the thicker the paper. And a thicker paper is good because it absorbs more water, it gives us more time to work. It says use lots of water without cockling, going all bumpy, but it's more expensive. So I would suggest that 300 GSM or 140 pounds is the minimum you want to look for. If you go thinner than that, it'll be cheaper, but you'll need to stretch it to work on it. If it's thicker, it might be particularly nice if you're doing a large painting, but it will cost you more. So that's what that's all about. Size is obvious. Watercolour paper comes in all sizes. The standard sheet is 30 by 22 inches, which is 76 by 56 centimetres. But you can also get rolls of paper. You can get huge sheets that are called double elephant, which is just the most brilliant name. I like to buy sheets of watercolour paper so I can cut them down. It's more economic, and it also forces me to think, do I want to work square? Do I want to work long and thin? Because the trouble with a pad is you tend to always work either that size or that size. You don't tend to vary it so much. You don't want sheets. A pad, of course, is very convenient. And you can get it something like this, which is a block. It is glued all the way round to keep it super flat. And somewhere on your block, there will be an unglued portion. Here it's just there at the top. And that allows you to put a knife under it to separate off a sheet of paper when you've finished. So you've painted it, it's stayed nice and flat. You can take it off, you've got a clean sheet underneath. Want one with a spiral binding, you can get them spiral at the top, spiral at the side. You can get them in sketchbooks all bound. And that's really personal preference. If you're going off to a painting class or painting outside, you might prefer a book, but if you're working in the studio, you might prefer sheets. It's called hot press paper, and I'm interested to see how much will get picked up on the camera. But if you look at that, it is smooth, very little texture there at all. And that's called hot press because literally it's put through hot rollers at the end of the manufacturing, and yeah, it's been ironed flat. So hot press is really good for detailed work where you don't want any texture to get in the way of your painting. So something like botanical, or if you're doing a really detailed line and wash, so you're doing very detailed, very fine pen work, and you don't want any texture from the paper interfering. Opposite for the hot press is cold press, and that's because they use cold rollers rather than the hot ones, so this doesn't get ironed quite as flat. Be awkward in the UK and in lots of Europe, we call it knot. This is a knot paper, so if you hear it called knot, it's the same as cold press. And why do we call it knot? We call it knot because it is not hot pressed. So on this occasion, I feel that the North Americans have it right. Cold press is more obvious. When it comes to weight, I think we have it right. That's more obvious. Anyway, really doesn't matter. If we look at the texture, there is a texture. It's just, again, I say, how much it will actually pick up on this camera, I'm not sure. But there are bumps and dips in the surface. Something to be aware of, that a cold press from, say, Meeden will be different than a cold press from, say, Bockingford or Arches. It just is. And they make the texture by putting the damp pieces of paper between blankets, and the blankets actually kind of wear out. So sometimes, even from the same manufacturer, one will be slightly bumpier than the other. Third texture is rough, and I won't give any prizes whatsoever for the fact that it's a rougher texture. More hills, more valleys. And you might say, well, what's the advantage of that? Well, rough, because it has hills and valleys, the hills can catch your paint and leave the valleys untouched. So if you like dry brushing, and that's particularly useful in landscape work, then a rough paper will be good for you. Rough paper from Meeden is going to be a different roughness than a rough paper that's, oh, I don't know, handmade. This is not a particularly rough texture. So if you like a really rough texture, you might look elsewhere. But if you don't want it to interfere too much in your painting, then you might like that. And cold press is in the middle. So it's got a little bit more personality than the hot press paper, but isn't quite as shouty as the rough. If you think it in personalities, this is your little introvert sitting in the corner at the party, doesn't really say anything, doesn't interfere with anything. This is your extrovert making jokes, getting the party going with a swing, and possibly being quite annoying and getting in the way of things. And then your cold press is someone in the middle who does make a contribution, cracks the occasional joke, but isn't a pain. Cold press is a good general paper. You can do line and wash work on it, you can do landscape work on it, and the texture isn't so obvious that it's going to get in the way. So generally, if you're going to only have one paper, I would go for that cold press. If you want to swap your papers around, then do try the other ones. Hot press is great for that detail I said. The downside is that actually all those little valleys, peaks and troughs catch the water and help you control it. There aren't any here, so the water can get quite out of control on the hot press. Well, rough, we said, brings a lovely texture to the party, but it can be a bit shouty, it can get in the way. And say you were painting, oh, I don't know, a young child, a portrait of a young child, you might not want that rough texture if you're trying to capture a lovely glowing skin. Why don't we just get some paint on them, and that will make the difference a little bit more obvious. And I've just got a palette with some leftover paint that nothing special, we're just going to use there. Oh, by the way, if you like little ceramic palettes, and look how sweet that is, that's Meeden has a really lovely selection, and they've given me a 10% off voucher that I'll put in the description, and you can use that on anything, so worth a look. We'll do a little bit of wet in wet, we'll have a go at glazing, and we'll do a little bit of dry brush work and just see how they behave on the three papers. So let's actually do a little bit of wet up to wet. This is the hot press paper, and I'm going to put a circle of colour and let them touch and see how they flow into each other. And that's all kind of pretty, isn't it? Look at that. That purple is such a bossy old colour. Oh, let's do another one. So just let that touch. And look, the yellow is starting to push into the green. Without that texture to grip onto the colour, it does let it flow, which is really rather nice. The downside of that is that if you're trying to get a really smooth wash, potentially it can be a little trickier because we haven't got anything to grip onto our colour, and it can be very prone to water blooms. But you know, that's just the downside. Let's just drop some colour in there, see how it moves around on the surface. And that's all rather lovely. Just put a clear circle there. Let's see what happens. Now, if I wanted to do some dry brushing, so that's when you haven't got a lot of paint on your brush and you drag it across the surface so it breaks up across the surface, you can see, because there aren't the hills and the troughs, that that's actually quite hard to achieve. Well, it's impossible, pretty much impossible. And you think, if that is what the surface of the paper looks like under a magnifying glass, usually when you do dry brushing, it hits here, 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 and that's left clean, clean, clean. So you get little speckles. You hardly get it at all on a hot press. And that's why it's a good paper for detail and not for expressive loose strokes. Grab the cold press and let's do exactly the same. So what did I do first? I did that circle of purple, circle of yellow, did a circle of the green, and then I did a circle of clean water. And this is not scientific, and maybe my brush wasn't quite as wet here, but it's not travelling quite as far, and that is what I'd expect, because say those hills and troughs just controls the flow of the water. They're not here, so it can go a bit more wild. And then we did a sort of square of the yellow. We just dropped in the red wet in wet to see what happens. Get those lovely soft edges. Let's see if it's easier to do that dry brushing. So I'm loading my brush, I'm going to take some of that off and then dragging it across the surface. And you can see, I'm not doing very good dry brushing, but just look at the difference between the hot press and the cold press. Third one. This is our rough, and we'll do just the same. So we've got our puddle of that lovely purple next to a puddle of yellow. They go and have a nice little fight. Say that purple is super bossy. Then we'll put some green brush or cleanish brush. And again, compared to the hot press, you can see it hasn't travelled quite as far. Let's do our yellow rectangle. And again, we get those lovely soft edges of wet in wet. This should be the dramatic difference. So let's do dry brushing. Got some blue. Just going to take off some of the excess and then drag it across the surface. And you can see that texture coming through. Now, if you were wanting to do a beautiful lake scene with the sun glinting on the water, that is going to be better than that. Again, you can just see it's a bit more dramatic than the cold press. That very quick little demonstration just shows you some of the differences between those surfaces. So that was the hot press, that was the cold press, and that's the rough, and gives you an idea of when you're going to be using those. And if you're an adventurous sort of artist, I would suggest, if you feel you're getting in a rut, change your paper. Either change the manufacturer or change the actual texture, and that will make a huge difference to the outcome.